Welcome to Making Peace Visible, the podcast that focuses on peace and conflict in the media. I'm your host, Jamil Simon. There's a famous quote about the UN from its second leader, Dag Hammarskjöld. He said, "The United Nations was not created in order to deliver us to heaven, but in order to save us from hell." Today, we'll hear from the co-host of a terrific new podcast about the UN called To Save Us from Hell. Mark Leon Goldberg and I first met in 2017 at a peace conference at Stanford University. He had already launched his first podcast, Global Dispatches. I didn't even know what a podcast was at that time. Mark was way ahead of his time. Mark is a journalist who's been reporting on the UN and global issues for 2 decades. Global Dispatches has grown and developed to the point that if there is an international issue or crisis, his podcast is the best place to go to learn more. Anjali Dayal is a professor of political science at Fordham University and is a scholar who's been studying the UN as her life's work. Their intense focus on the UN comes at a time when the world's focus on the institution seems to be diminishing. This is ironic because we live in a dangerous moment in world history with several hot wars going on. Ukraine, Israel and Gaza, and the Sudan grab most of the headlines, but there are others. We also have global crises like climate change, infectious disease, and refugees. The one global institution designated to deal with problems at that scale is the UN. Yet it seems to be less and less effective as time goes on. But speaking with Mark and Anjali gave me a renewed appreciation for the UN and its work, especially when it comes to peace. Like I always say on this podcast, much of the work behind peace building is invisible. The significant role the UN provides in mobilizing peacekeeping forces is a critical off-ramp to violent conflicts. And while there have been significant failures, Mark and Anjali pointed to places in the world where the UN peacekeepers help enable lasting peace and stability. We also talked about the role of the UN in some of today's most troubling conflicts, like the situation in Haiti and escalating violence along the border between Israel and Lebanon, and how the Security Council gets things done when no one is paying a whole lot of attention. So here's my interview with Mark Leon Goldberg and Anjali Dayal, co-hosts of the new podcast, To Save Us from Hell. I started off by asking Anjali, who teaches a class about the UN, how she explains the significance of the institution to her students.
You know, it's funny because before Mark ever pitched this podcast to me, for years I've actually started out the syllabus with the same Dag Hammarskjöld quote that lends the title to our podcast, which is that the United Nations was not created in order to bring us to heaven, but to save us from hell. I started teaching this class in 2015, and I think something I've seen increasingly over the years since then, but was there right from the beginning, was that this generation of students actually understands something that maybe people slightly older than them don't, which is that we have global problems that can only have global solutions that require cooperation. They are a generation from them on downwards that is forged an understanding that things like climate disaster are the result of global processes and can't be solved with individual solutions. And because of that, they often come to the classroom interested in, how this institution works, how its processes work. And I also, I do want to say that because this is a student body that has chosen to sort of either come to a global city or is from a global city and is from the city where the UN lives, they have a particular interest. So to some extent, I don't have to make the case to them. But in other ways, because what they see in the news is so often a sense of what the UN doesn't do or what the UN can't do or its limitations or its failures, they are there to sort of learn about what the limits certainly are, but what the possibilities for action are as well.
Right. And that's important because I think that generation wants to have a role, wants to have some efficacy in this whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
On this podcast, we talk a lot about the process of peace building. Peace building is working towards peace, whether it's a formal agreement or less formal projects to build bridges between opposing groups. But sometimes when people hear the word peace building, they confuse it with peacekeeping, which is something else. What is peacekeeping and how does it work?
The classic example of a peacekeeping mission is one in which two warring parties, for one reason or another, whether through exhaustion or diplomatic pressure, decide that they want to enter into some sort of ceasefire, some sort of cessation of hostilities, but require a measure of breathing room in order to implement or sustain that ceasefire. And this is where UN peacekeepers come in. You have ostensibly neutral forces who occupy typically a territory that had been fought over, and they exist there until the warring parties have implemented their ceasefire agreement and come to a more lasting political solution. If you look at some classic peacekeeping successes, you think of West Africa, you think of Liberia, you think of Sierra Leone. 20 years ago, these were places of really the most brutal armed conflict in the world. It's where we get the concept of blood diamonds. You had over 250,000 people killed in Liberia's civil war. Today, there are no UN peacekeeping missions there because they work themselves out of a job. The conflicts there ended a little bit through international intervention, but peacekeepers helped lay the groundwork for peace. These peacekeeping missions not only just occupied territory to give warring parties breathing room, but they also provided the security that gave development agencies and political agencies space to build peace from the ground up in these countries. You look at Liberia, and now Liberia has had, several successful free elections, including a changeover of power from one party to the other. And, it's still a very poor country, but it's one that is stable, thanks in large part to UN peacekeepers that successfully worked themselves out of a job.
Right. In a sense, the peacekeeping that the UN did made peace building a possibility. Is that an accurate description?
Yeah, I would say that. And also, I know this is just a topic that Anjali has done a lot of research on and wrote a book about. So I'll pass over to her. I'm not an academic. I just play one on a podcast.
Yeah, Anjali, you wrote a book about the failures of UN peacekeeping missions and how those failures affect peace processes in places like Somalia and Rwanda and Balkans. Can you tell us about one of those peacekeeping missions and what its actual effect was on peace? And also tease apart a little bit this relationship between peace building and peacekeeping.
Yes, absolutely. So there are two core peacekeeping missions that form the sort of backbone of the book. The UN's mission to Rwanda in the 1990s, beginning after the Second Rwandan Civil War, ending shortly after the Rwandan genocide, and the UN's mission to Guatemala in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And in both cases, my question was why UN peacekeeping outlasts these huge failures that cost enormous numbers of people's lives and really sort of damage the credibility of the institution. So the question is, why does it persist after these failures? Why do we live in a world where UN peacekeeping remains one of the key tools we have for conflict resolution and to enable peace building in the world? And the answer that I arrive at by looking at these two cases is that peacekeeping is valuable to warring parties because they don't expect the warring parties to bring them security. What they do need is a whole host of other kinds of peace-building tools that only come with UN peacekeeping. So they need things like state building. They need things like refugee resettlement. They need things like post-conflict aid and reconstruction. And you can only get those with the presence of UN peacekeepers. You can only get those if you sign a peace agreement, and then you get the full suite of multilateral involvement that will help you move out of war and into peace. And a fourth thing that you might get from the involvement of UN peacekeepers, and this is critical, is political legitimacy. If you have signed an agreement and you have demonstrated that you are willing to work with the international community, right, that serves as a powerful indicator that you're not just a group of men who kill people in the bush, right? You're legitimate political actors.
This week's episode talked about the role of UNIFIL, the UN peacekeeping force that's been quietly keeping a lid on the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. And I want to emphasize the word quietly, because it's at the heart of the problem of reporting on peace in general. Peace doesn't make a lot of noise.
Yeah.
And UNIFIL is a force of 10,000 peacekeeping soldiers. It's the largest in the UN's portfolio. Since UNIFIL has been there, the border between Lebanon and Israel has been relatively quiet. So we don't hear about it in the news. And because the conflict has subsided. UNIFIL was accepted by both parties because it gave them an off-ramp. Neither one wanted a wider war. It seems to me that the world could use a few more off-ramps to our many wars and conflicts. Now, with the war in Gaza threatening to explode into regional warfare, there's increased focus on the role of this peacekeeping force. Can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, and I know this is sort of like the basis of your project and podcast, it's really hard to cover peace, right? When UN peacekeeping works, nothing happens, right? Decades and decades of nothing happens. Failure is loud and visible, and it understandably gets headlines. Peace takes a very long time. Peacekeepers on the ground, when they're effective, it takes decades. And when they leave, nothing happens. That is not an easy thing to cover. It's part of why work like the work that Global Dispatches and Mark have been doing is so important, because it will cover stories that don't necessarily grab headlines, but are important to understand. And they're important to understand the underlying dynamics that produce outcomes like peace. And I want to say this isn't something that's unique to sort of media, right? It's hard to explain peace. In scholarship even, we have a lot of ways to measure and count war and not that many ways to measure and count peace. The anthropologist Maggie Paxson says that even a scholar as sharp as Marx, when he tries to describe peace, says it's like a lamb legs folded under a tree. What does that look like in real life, right? Nothing.
Right. I mean, we really, in a nutshell, we touched on a whole bunch of issues that are really central to our mission of making peace more visible. Mark, as we're recording this on June 27th, this week, 400 police officers from Kenya arrived in Haiti to help confront armed gangs which control much of the country and to help restore order. Gangs in Haiti have killed thousands and forced hundreds of thousands to leave their homes. So it seems like the international community should help, but is it the right kind of help?
Yeah, I mean, from my reporting, and I've done a few episodes on this very topic, you have a couple of kind of key themes emerging. The first is that, if you were to ask the people of Haiti, do they want some sort of international intervention? The answer would be yes, they do. The situation has spiraled so out of control. And it's important to keep in mind that, as these gangs have expanded their control over larger and larger swaths of Port-au-Prince and other parts of the country, the humanitarian situation has deteriorated precipitously. The cost of fuel has skyrocketed. Food is getting more expensive. And so it really is an urgent situation. So there is, in theory, this need for an international force to help support the government reestablish control of Haiti. However, simultaneously, if you were to survey the people of Haiti, they have zero confidence in their government, which is totally illegitimate and hasn't been elected. Now, there has been some progress in recent weeks. The former Prime Minister, Ariel Henry, who took over the job following the assassination of his predecessor, Jovenel Moïse, he was in Kenya trying to whip up support for this international force. And there's been a political process in the meantime that led to a transitional prime minister, Gary Conille. And, he is now the new prime minister. This new government presumably has a bit more legitimacy. These Haitian police officers arrived just a couple of days ago. I think the jury is out whether or not they'll make a meaningful difference on the ground. So we'll have to see, I think, whether or not this indeed is a kind of intervention that can meaningfully help the people of Haiti.
Right. No, and it's such a difficult, challenging situation. Mark, in June, the UN held an election for the Security Council, its most powerful body. The Security Council has 5 permanent member countries: China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The other 10 members rotate, and the recent election was for 5 of those seats. However, everybody knew who would win before the election took place. How did that happen?
So at the United Nations, as you noted, at the Security Council, you have 10 elected members who serve 2-year terms each, and then the 5 permanent members. The 10 elected members each have a seat reserved for a respective region. So there are seats reserved for what's known as Western Europe and others, seats reserved for Africa, seats reserved for Asia. And sometimes what happens at elections at the United Nations is that the regions collude amongst themselves to nominate an equal number of candidates as there are open seats. So by the time the entire membership of the UN votes on their candidacies, the election is non-competitive. We know that Somalia, or whatever country it is going to get the 1 seat available for Africa at the Security Council. We know that the Netherlands will get the 1 seat available for Western Europe at the Human Rights Council, or whatever it is. And so that's how you end up with these situations. You know, the UN wants to be geographically representative, but sometimes it results in what I find to be the unfortunate circumstance of there being non-competitive elections. You don't have countries running against each other to demonstrate their capacities and their qualifications for being on a seat. Rather, they just win the seat because, in some cases, it's where they land in the alphabetical order of other countries in their region.
Well, those 5 countries that I've just mentioned, those with the permanent seats, they not only have their permanent seats, but they also have veto power, which the 10 rotating countries don't have. And the power of the veto is pretty clear. The Security Council can't pass a resolution against the war in Ukraine because Russia is a member, and it vetoes it. So what kind of influence can the non-veto holding members have?
Look, they have a lot. A resolution needs at least 9 affirmative votes to pass the Security Council, and no vetoes. So you need a set number of the non-permanent members to vote in the affirmative on any resolution. And there have been times that resolutions fail, not owing to a veto, but owing to the fact that there aren't enough affirmative votes. So their vote really does matter. Also, these non-permanent members can work with the veto-wielding members in ways to advance issues that sometimes might be a little too hot to handle for the P5. And you've seen that in particular on humanitarian issues in Syria in 2011, I think it was. You had Sweden and a few other countries advance, important humanitarian resolutions to get aid into besieged parts of Syria.
Right. The common reason we discuss for the lack of coverage of peace efforts in the news media is that it's challenging to find the drama in negotiations. But if you look for it, there is drama in peace building. You've been covering, Mark, the UN for almost 20 years on your website, UN Dispatch and Global Dispatches. Where do you find the drama in covering the United Nations?
Recently, specifically in regards to UN peacekeeping, we have seen a retreat of UN peacekeeping, specifically the mission in Mali, which was one of the larger and frankly more dangerous and deadly peacekeeping missions in the world. It had deployed in the, 2012-ish, in response to a civil war that erupted in Mali, and the fact that Mali was being overrun by jihadist extremists. The French intervened to repel these jihadist extremists from overrunning most of the country. And then you had a UN peacekeeping force kind of fill its place. And that peacekeeping force had been doing an okay job. But then you've had a series of coups in Mali, and the new coup leaders have been more aligned with Russia than they have with the West and with the broader UN system, and recently ordered the expulsion of this peacekeeping group. And so you have kind of like a live action experiment now of what happens to a country when peacekeepers are forced to abruptly leave. And they're being forced to do that because
when did that happen?
That happened last year. And we're kind of seeing the results of it now. And so there is drama, there's certainly drama on the peacekeeping front in the fact that, peacekeeping, when I first started covering the UN, was a solution that the international community turned to over and over again to kind of keep a lid on conflicts, keep conflicts from like festering out of control. But there hasn't been a new UN peacekeeping mission approved in over 10 years. And in fact, now peacekeeping is on the retreat globally. Missions like Mali are closing up shop. Not because they, like Liberia, where they successfully, completed their mission. In Mali, it's because they're getting kicked out.
Mark, as you point out on the podcast, in the trailer for the podcast, news coverage of the UN is diminishing. And I know you're an independent journalist, but if you were going to make a case to a U.S. news media outlet about why it should devote resources to covering the United Nations, what would you tell them?
Well, the work of the UN impacts many, many millions of people around the world. Now, oftentimes the places where these people live are not proximate, either geographically or politically, to capital cities or major cities in the Western world. But what I believe ought to drive news coverage is not proximity, but rather news ought to be driven by the number of people impacted or affected by any given situation. News ought to combine kind of core principles of humanitarianism, which seeks to shine a spotlight and cover and respond to crises that impact people because they impact people no matter where they are.
Right. This is, in a sense, a flip side of the question, and I'd welcome thoughts from both of you. How do you think the UN is doing on their end when it comes to communicating with journalists?
Like the UN, in air quotes, is like a lot of things. When it comes to like the office of the Secretary General and like the Secretariat of the UN, I think they do like a very good job of explaining and discussing, what the, Secretary General is up to any given day, what's happening around the UN building. They do like, I think, a good job of that, to be honest. And there's like professional spokespeople who are good at their job, who get you the information you need when you ask them. So like very, very kind of few complaints about that. It's like accessible as a journalist. You can apply for credentials, you can get in, you can ask questions. I think the broader challenge is like, not born of like how the UN itself communicates about its work, but how people, I think, understand the UN's work. For example, there's like a really important meeting around the UN coming up called the Summit of the Future, right? This is a really big deal inside the UN bubble for the fact that it promises and anticipates to be a vehicle for enacting some of like the reforms that a lot of people agree are necessary to make the UN a more effective institution. But like the importance of this Summit of the Future inside the UN bubble is not reflected, I think, outside the UN bubble.
Speaking to that point, Angela, most people probably couldn't name a UN employee apart from the Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Something that's different about To Save Us from Hell is that you talk about individuals within the United Nations. Why is it important to put faces and names to what's often seen as a faceless entity in the media?
I think it's so important because, as Mark just said, the UN is many different things, right? And it reflects state interests. It's made up of member states, but it doesn't necessarily replace them. It also serves as an independent bureaucracy and a body of agencies that do practical work on the ground and a body of experts that gather information about the state of the world. It's also a platform, an important platform for states and civil society to advance their goals and ideas about foreign policy and about the human condition, right? And it is what we call a norm entrepreneur. It is a institution that espouses certain values and certain ideas about what's good and right and true. And all of these things depend on the work of people. So we should know who those people are and what their ideas about the world are.
Well, you're a professional UN watcher. For us amateurs, if you want to start paying attention to what's going on at the United Nations, who are the ones to watch? Who are the key players?
If you are interested in starting to sort of get a sense of what the UN is like, the UN produces a bunch of forward-facing UN TV segments and documentation of the work it's doing. And that's an interesting entry point. If you are interested in seeing what the Security Council does, a lot of their meetings are broadcast. So you can sit down and watch them. And sometimes they are, just let's be frank, utterly dull. Sometimes they are remarkably dynamic because people are talking to each other directly about issues on which they sharply disagree. And so in that sense, they're an interesting way to start. I would say if you're interested in human rights, to take a look at the work of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and its work out of Geneva, and to read the sort of reports they provide. A lot of different UN bodies have an education mandate built into them so that they are doing public-facing work that no one is necessarily covering in as much detail as they should be, but is accessible to the public. If you are interested in issues of refugees and migration, the UN High Commission for Refugees, again, puts out a lot of public-facing documentation, work, reports. All of those things are accessible to the public via their website. I would say if you're interested in international justice, the ICC does an interesting job of trying to do some public education about what its work and mandate is. And so all of those things are, places where sometimes the website isn't as accessible as it should be, but often there is a lot of audio-visual documentation that people can start to access and look at and, develop their own sense of what's happening.
And if you want an interesting, accessible, and weekly analysis and news of what's happening at the United Nations, I do suggest, of course, that you listen to Anjali and I's new podcast, To Save Us From Hell. You can access it via globaldispatches.org, which is our homepage. To Save Us From Hell is a project of Global Dispatches. But it's great. You get to hear Anjali's insights every single week.
Yeah, it's fabulous. What are some of the topics you're planning to discuss on the podcast this summer?
We are going to be planning an episode around the Republican convention, looking at how a Donald Trump presidency might impact the United Nations. We're going to try to get the Malta ambassador to the United Nations on our show to discuss what we were discussing about earlier. Malta is a member of the Security Council, a non-permanent member, and ask her, how she advances issues related to international peace and security as a non-elected member of the council. And finally, we'll take some vacation time, but won't miss a week on the episode. So Anjali and I were going to kind of pre-record an episode about how the UN is portrayed in music and in movies. That should be a fun one.
Oh, that would be interesting. Well, so far, I've listened to your first two episodes, and they're terrific.
That's 100% of our content thus far, so thank you.
And they're great. They opened my eyes to a lot of things that I didn't really understand well. So I wish you best of luck in growing your audience for this and in continuing this important work.
And you as well. I'm always a fan of what you do, Jamil.
Thank you very much, Mark. And Anjali, it was a pleasure to meet you.
It was a pleasure to meet you as well. Thank you so much for listening and for having us on.
You can find the first two episodes of To Save Us From Hell on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Mark and Anjali are supporting the show through subscriptions. To get access to all of their future content, go to globaldispatches.org and sign up. Please also consider supporting our work at Making Peace Visible, including our new education initiative with journalist and scholar Steve Youngblood. To learn more, go to makingpeacevisible.org/education and hit the donate button to give. If you'd like to support us in other ways, Please leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. You can also leave a rating on Spotify, the mobile app. Or tell a friend about our show. It means a lot. The Making Peace Visible podcast is produced and edited by Andrea Maraskin, with help from Faith McClure. Stephen Youngblood directs MPV's new education initiative. I'm Jamil Simon. Thanks so much for listening, and talk soon.